All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys know the drill. You send us the stuff that's got you scratching your heads, and we dig in, pull out the nuggets of gold, and try to make sense of it all. No more drowning in a sea of reports and regulations. We're like your expert lifeguards in the world of information.
And today's tide is pulling us towards a particularly interesting section of the Forged Act. We're diving into Section 310.
Modifications to commercial product and commercial service determinations by Department of Defense. Kitschy, right?
Yeah, well, government titles, you know. But honestly, this section has the potential to really shake up the way DoD buys, well, pretty much everything.
Absolutely. Section 310 is it's a game changer. It actually amends Title 10, U.S. Code, Section 3456. Big deal. Huge. Because now there's this default presumption that anything the DoD wants to buy is commercial.
Yeah, they flipped the script. Instead of proving something is commercial, now you have to prove it isn't.
So no more jumping through hoops to buy something that's readily available. Like, say, off-the-shelf software or, I don't know, office supplies.
Exactly. The starting point is commercial. If the DoD decides something is non-commercial, meaning it's got to be custom-made, specifically for military use, well, they're going to have to justify that. And that paperwork, oof.
Streamlining things, huh? Cutting through the red tape.
That's the idea. Prioritize those standard commercial procedures. Makes sense, right?
On the surface, yeah. But, like, why this change now? What's the backstory?
Okay, so this whole push for using commercial stuff in the DoD, it isn't exactly new. You can trace it back to the 1994 Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. You know, the goal back then was to, like, tap into that commercial innovation, you know, get things cheaper and faster, all that good stuff. You can actually find some really good info on this over at crsreports.congress.gov if you're interested.
So they had the right idea back then. What happened?
Well, think of it like planting a seed. The seed was there, but it didn't quite sprout the way they hoped. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, kept finding these barriers. And a lot of them came down to how they defined commercial items. The definition was like too narrow, too restrictive. It was actually blocking them from getting cool new stuff, you know, stuff that was already out there, just waiting to be used. There's actually a whole bunch of reports on this over at discover.deethic.mil if you want to go down that rabbit hole.
Sounds like a bureaucratic maze. Did they ever try to fix it?
Oh, they tried. In 2016, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, you know, they tried to broaden those commercial preferences. But, well, you know how it goes. The defense.gov histories, they basically show that all that red tape, yeah, it was still there. Slowing things down, getting in the way.
Bureaucracy, man. It's like a hydra. You cut off one head, two more grow back. So what was the final straw? What finally got them to say, okay, enough is enough. We need a real change?
It was a combination of things, really. There was pressure from, like, inside the defense world, too. Defense Science Board, the DSB, they were pretty vocal about it. They're over at dsb.cto.mil, by the way. Their whole point was, like, why are we building all this custom stuff when there's perfectly good, even better stuff already out there in the commercial world? And they were right. You know, it just didn't make sense.
Makes you wonder how much time and money they wasted, you know. Reinventing the wheel over and over again.
Right. And that's where Section 310 comes in. It's like the culmination of like decades of frustration and wasted potential. Senator Roger Wicker, he introduced it back in December 2024 as part of Senate Bill 5618. And it finally puts that preference for commercial stuff into law. No more messing around. If you want to dig deeper, check out innovation.defense.gov, and defense.gov, they have some pretty good summaries.
So we get the why. Now, let's talk about the what. What's the goal here? What are they hoping to achieve with Section 310?
They actually lay out 5 desired effects. It's all right there in the recommendation. First one, like we talked about, establish that default commercial presumption. Simplify things right from the start. Less red tape, right?
Makes sense. What else?
Number 2, reduce the need to develop all that defense-unique stuff. You know, the thought is, if you can find a good commercial solution, you're going to save a ton of money. Why spend all that time and money developing something from scratch when there's something out there that's just as good, maybe even better?
So efficiency breeds innovation. That's the hope, anyway.
Exactly. The third desired effect is all about encouraging more open competition. You know, they want to use more general solicitations under 10 U.S.C. Section 3458. That basically means more public bidding, simpler procedures. It's supposed to be more streamlined than those really specific defense-unique solicitations.
And that leads into the fourth goal, right?
Yeah.
Speed things up.
Yep. Speed up acquisitions. And finally, number 5, better access to all those cool, innovative products coming out of the commercial sector. You know, they're constantly developing new stuff way faster than the defense world. So the idea is make it easier to buy that stuff, and the DoD can keep up, meet their needs in a way that's like actually efficient.
It's almost like they're trying to catch up with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Technology-wise.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of that. It's not just about saving money, it's about being able to adapt and evolve, The commercial world moves fast, and the DoD needs to keep up. Think about AI, cloud computing, all that stuff. Imagine being able to use the latest and greatest instead of being stuck with outdated tech.
So, a lot of potential benefits. But you know what they say, every rose has its thorns. What about the downsides? Are there any potential negative impacts they've identified?
Of course. I mean, you got to look at both sides of the coin, right? They've actually highlighted 5 potential negative impacts. First one, and this is a big one, relying too much on commercial stuff could lead to, overlooking those really specific defense needs. Some things in the military, they just need to be custom made. You can't just go to Amazon and buy a fighter jet.
Right, some things just can't be bought off the shelf.
Exactly. The second potential problem is, those justifications for non-commercial stuff, they're supposed to make things more transparent, but what if they just create more bureaucracy, more paperwork, more delays? It could defeat the whole purpose of streamlining things.
Ah, the irony. And what's number 3?
This one's about the defense industry. Those traditional defense contractors. They're the ones who build all that specialized military stuff. Well, if the DoD starts buying more commercial products, those contractors could end up losing a lot of business. It could really shake things up in the defense industry.
Force them to adapt or die, basically.
Pretty much. It could lead to some interesting partnerships, though. Traditional contractors teaming up with commercial companies. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, number 4. This one's about market research. What if they don't do enough of it and they end up buying commercial stuff that doesn't actually meet military standards? Could end up costing more in the long run if they have to replace or fix things that weren't up to snuff.
Right. Just because something works in the civilian world doesn't mean it can handle the demands of a military operation.
Exactly. And the 5th potential negative impact. This one's about innovation, but on the defense side. If they focus too much on buying commercial, they might end up neglecting the development of those really specialized, cutting-edge military technologies, the stuff that gives them an edge.
So there's definitely a balance to be struck. They can't just abandon their own research and development entirely.
Right. It's a trade-off. More commercial, less defense unique. They'd have to find that sweet spot.
Okay, so potential problems, check. Now, what about solutions? What are they planning to do to, address these potential negative impacts?
Well, they've laid out some mitigations the organization will take to diminish the negative impacts. Important to remember, though, these are just suggested mitigations. They're not set in stone. One idea is to have operational reviews. Before they buy something commercial, they'd get input from the people who would actually be using it. Make sure it actually meets their needs.
Makes sense. Get the end users involved.
Yeah, it's all about practicality. And for those justifications for non-commercial stuff, they're talking about making those processes super clear, setting strict deadlines, prevent it from becoming this big bureaucratic mess.
Okay, so streamline the paperwork. What about those defense contractors? Any ideas for helping them adapt?
Yeah, they're actually suggesting incentives, encouraging them to partner with commercial companies, diversify their offerings, help them stay competitive in this new landscape.
Smart. It's better to bring them along than leave them behind.
Agreed. And to prevent those market research mishaps, they want to make sure those contracting officers really know their stuff. Give them training on how to evaluate commercial products, make sure they're asking the right questions.
Due diligence, basically?
Exactly. And finally, for those really critical defense-unique projects, they're talking about keeping some flexibility in the rules. Acknowledging that some things will always need to be developed in-house. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So basically, they're trying to cover all the bases, anticipate the problems, and come up with solutions beforehand.
That's the goal. Whether it'll work in practice, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so we've talked about the why and the what. Now let's talk about the who. Who's going to be most affected by all this?
They actually identify 3 groups. First, those contracting officers. Their jobs are about to get a lot more, commercial. They'll need to know how to evaluate these products, understand the commercial market. Then there's the heads of contracting activities.
Right.
They're the ones who approve those non-commercial designations, so they'll have a lot more responsibility on their shoulders. And finally, those program managers. They're the ones who have to justify why they need something defense unique. They're going to need to be really clear, really specific, really convincing.
So a lot of folks are going to need to brush up on their skills. And what about opposition? We talked about those traditional contractors, but is anyone else likely to push back against these changes?
Yeah, definitely. Besides the contractors who are, understandably worried about losing business, you've also got some program managers who might not be too happy about this. They're used to having a lot of flexibility, defining those really specific requirements. This could feel like a bit of constraint.
Taking away some of their autonomy, I could see how that would ruffle some feathers.
And then you've got the congressional folks, the overseers. They're going to be worried about national security, making sure the U.S. maintains its technological edge. If they think this push for commercial stuff is going to weaken the military, make them less capable, they're going to put up a fight.
Makes sense. They have a responsibility to look at the big picture. So it sounds like this Section 310 is going to be pretty controversial, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of potential pushback.
Definitely. It's a big change, and big changes always come with challenges.
All right, so let's say they do implement Section 310. How will they know if it's working? Are there any metrics for success?
They've got a few ideas. Again, it's important to remember these are suggested measures, not like hard and fast rules. First one, they're going to be looking at the number of commercial contracts. They want to see a 20% increase. That's their target.
Okay, so more commercial contracts equals success. What else?
Speed. They want those procurements to be 15% faster. Less time wasted on paperwork, more time getting the stuff they need.
So time is money, literally. And the third metric?
Cold, hard cash. They want to see cost savings of at least 10%. And they're going to be tracking that every year. They'll be watching those numbers very closely.
Well, those are some pretty specific goals. Makes it easier to hold them accountable, Now, were there any other options on the table besides this big legislative change?
Yeah, they did consider a couple of potential alternative approaches. One idea was to just, tweak the existing rules, make those commercial item definitions a bit more flexible, update the guidance, provide more training, that kind of thing.
So a more incremental approach.
Exactly. And the other option was a pilot program. They talked about this a lot over at innovation.defense.gov. The idea was to test it out on a smaller scale, see how it works, identify any problems, and then, gradually expand it if it's successful.
A more cautious approach, for
Right.
sure. Less disruptive.
Right, but also potentially slower. I mean, it could take years to fully implement something like that.
So, in the end, they went with a big, bold move. The legislative overhaul.
Yeah, they did. Guess they figured it was time for a real shakeup.
Well, this has been a fascinating look at Section 310. It's definitely a major shift in how the DoD thinks about acquisitions.
It is. It's a clear sign that they're serious about embracing commercial solutions, about, modernizing their approach. Like we talked about earlier, this has been a long time coming.
And for our listeners out there, understanding these goals, the potential pitfalls, and the proposed solutions, it's crucial. It's going to affect everyone involved in the defense world one way or another.
Absolutely. This isn't just some abstract policy change. It has real-world implications. And, even if you're not directly involved in acquisitions, you should still pay attention.
Yeah.
This is about how the DoD stays competitive, how they equip our troops, how they, defend our national interests. It's a big deal.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap things up, here's a question for our listeners. Think about all those amazing technologies and processes out there in the commercial world. What do you think has the potential to revolutionize the defense landscape? What's that hidden gem, that game changer that the DoD should be looking at? That's something to think about, as we all navigate this new era of commercial first defense. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.